He was a man who had it all: power, money, absolute control over his empire. But that night, when he opened the wrong door, Jackson Blake saw something that no contract, no meeting, no conquest had ever prepared his heart to feel. She was there, vulnerable, real, unexpectedly beautiful, and in seconds, his world turned upside down. What started as an embarrassing mistake became the best decision of his life. If you're ready to dive into a story of desire, transformation, and true love, subscribe to the channel now. Leave a like if you also believe that the best loves begin in the most unexpected places, and comment where you're listening to this story from. Your support is what keeps these emotions alive here. Night fell over Manhattan like a black velvet cloak dotted with artificial stars. From the 40th floor, the city looked like a living organism, lights pulsing like neon veins, the distant hum of traffic sounding like a giant heart beating without pause. But inside Jackson Blake's penthouse, the silence was deafening. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands in the pockets of his Italian dress pants, shoulders tense beneath his impeccably pressed white shirt. The reflection in the glass showed a 38-year-old man with a square jaw and steel-gray eyes that had closed billion-dollar deals, but now seemed empty, tired, lost. The apartment around him was a masterpiece of minimalist architecture: Carrara marble on the walls, Scandinavian design furniture, contemporary artworks that cost more than entire apartments in other neighborhoods, everything perfectly positioned, everything cold, everything soulless. Jackson picked up the glass of 25-year-old Scotch whiskey resting on the side table. The amber liquid caught the city lights, creating golden reflections. He brought the crystal to his lips, felt the smoky aroma fill his nostrils, but when the taste touched his tongue, he felt no pleasure. Just the same emptiness as always. When did all of this stop meaning anything? The question echoed in his mind as his eyes scanned the urban horizon. He had built an empire. Blake Tech Solutions was synonymous with innovation, traded on the stock exchange, had offices in 15 countries. Business magazines plastered his face on their covers with headlines like "The Midas King of the Digital Age" and "The Most Influential CEO Under 40." But who called him at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep? Who asked how his day had been? Who really knew him beyond the tailored suits and ruthless decisions in boardrooms? No one. The soft sound of a door closing in the distance brought Jackson back to the present moment. He turned his head slightly, alert. It was her, the new household employee, Deborah Williams, hired 3 weeks ago by the agency that managed his domestic staff. He'd been watching her for days, always from a distance, always in silence. There was something about her that intrigued him in a way he couldn't name. It wasn't just her appearance, though she was naturally beautiful with those deep brown eyes, the olive skin that seemed to carry the warmth of the sun, the dark hair always pulled back in a simple bun. No, it was something else. It was the way she moved through the apartment, like a respectful shadow that knew exactly when to appear and when to disappear. It was the almost reverent care with which she arranged his things, folding towels with surgical precision, adjusting pillows with delicacy, watering the ornamental plants as if they were living beings that deserved attention. It was her silence, not an empty silence, but a loaded one, as if there was an entire story being kept inside those eyes that rarely met his. Jackson caught himself thinking about her more often than he cared to admit. When he was in tedious meetings, his mind would wander to the image of her folding clothes in the laundry room. When he signed multi-million-dollar contracts, he'd wonder what she might be doing at that exact moment. When he ate dinner alone at the 12-seat dining table, he'd imagine what it would be like to hear her voice beyond the polite, "Good morning, Mr. Blake, and may I bring you something, sir? What is it about you that throws me off balance?" He shook his head, trying to push away the thoughts. It was inappropriate. She was his employee. There was a clear line that shouldn't be crossed: hierarchy, protocol, professional ethics. But then why did his heart race when he heard her soft footsteps in the hallway? Why did his eyes automatically search for her when he entered a room? Why did he feel a strange restlessness, almost adolescent, as if something fundamental was about to change? Jackson finished the whiskey in one gulp, feeling the liquid burn his throat. He set the empty glass down on the table harder than he'd intended. The sound echoed through the empty space of the apartment. In that moment, As if summoned by his thoughts, Deborah appeared in the living room entrance. She paused when she saw him, her eyes widening slightly, surprised to find him still awake at that hour. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blake." Her voice was soft, almost musical, with an accent he couldn't quite place. "I didn't know you were still up. I just came to check if you needed anything before turning in." Jackson turned completely to face her. The soft city light coming through the windows created a halo around her silhouette. She wore the simple uniform the agency provided, a modest grey dress that fell to her knees, low-heeled shoes already worn at the edges. But there was a dignity in her posture, a quiet strength in her squared shoulders, even beneath the visible exhaustion. "I don't need anything," he replied, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. He cleared his throat. "You work late." Deborah lowered her eyes, a slight blush rising to her cheeks. "There's always something to do, sir, and I prefer to keep myself busy." There were layers to that simple answer. Jackson felt them, even without fully understanding. Something in the way she said, "prefer to keep myself busy," sounded like a veiled confession, as if work was a refuge, an escape from something painful. "Who hurt you? Who taught you to be invisible?" "You live in the back room?" he asked, knowing the answer, but wanting to prolong that moment, that conversation. "Yes, sir. It's very comfortable." "I appreciate the accommodation." Comfortable. Jackson knew that room was tiny. He'd passed by it once, years ago, when the apartment was being renovated. It barely fit a twin bed, a narrow wardrobe, and a small desk. The window looked out onto the ventilation shaft. There was no view, no luxury, but she was grateful, as if it were more than she deserved. "Do you have family, Deborah?" The question came out before he could stop it, too intimate, too personal, crossing lines. She hesitated, her fingers interlacing in front of her body, nervous. "I have my grandmother, sir. She's sick. That's why I'm here. I need to work to take care of her." The vulnerability in those words hit Jackson like a punch to the stomach. There it was, the story kept in her eyes. Sacrifice, love, responsibility, things he'd forgotten still existed in the world. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and he truly was. "Is she getting the care she needs?" Deborah raised her eyes to him for the first time, really looked at him, and Jackson felt the air leave his lungs. There was so much strength in that look, so much determination mixed with fear, so much raw and honest beauty. "I'm doing what I can, sir," she whispered. "It's all I can do." The silence that followed was thick, charged with unspoken things. Jackson wanted to say something, offer help, ask questions, move closer, but the words stuck in his throat, blocked by years of emotional control, of walls built brick by brick. "You should rest," he finally said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "Good night, Deborah." "Good night, Mr. Blake." She turned to leave, her soft footsteps on the wooden floor. But before disappearing completely down the hallway, she stopped. Turned slightly, only her profile visible. "Sir, may I say something?" "You may. This place is beautiful. But it feels lonely. I hope one day you find someone to fill it with life." And then she was gone, leaving Jackson alone with the echo of those words and a heart that beat in a strange way, as if waking from a deep sleep. He turned back to look at the city outside. But now something had changed. The emptiness felt less absolute. The night less cold. And for the first time in years, Jackson Blake found himself smiling. The following week brought a strange routine for Jackson Blake, a routine he'd never experienced in all his years of relentless success. He began to notice things, small things, things that had been invisible amid his commitments, corporate strategies, and financial achievements. He noticed that Deborah always arrived at 6 in the morning, even though her official hours started at 7. He noticed that she saved leftovers in carefully labeled containers, probably took them home for her grandmother. He noticed that her shoes, though always clean and polished, had worn soles mended with glue on the sides. He noticed that she never ate until she was certain he'd finished, as if her own hunger were secondary, insignificant. And he noticed her eyes, always lowered, always cautious, but occasionally, in moments when she thought she was alone, carrying a sadness so deep it seemed rooted in some place beyond the present. Jackson caught himself modifying his own routine, just to cross paths with her. He'd come home earlier. He'd invent excuses to pass through the kitchen. He'd ask for coffee even when he didn't want it. He'd leave doors open to hear her voice talking softly on the phone with her grandmother. This is crazy, he'd think. You're acting like a teenager, but he couldn't stop. That Thursday, everything changed. The night had been particularly brutal. A tense meeting with investors that lasted until 11 o'clock. Heated discussions about the company's direction, veiled threats disguised as strategic concerns. Jackson came home with his jaw locked in tension, shoulders rigid as stone, mind racing through millions of calculations and countermeasures. It was almost midnight when he opened the penthouse door. The apartment was silent, bathed only in the soft light coming from the city outside. He loosened his tie as he walked, removing his jacket and tossing it on the sofa, a rare gesture of carelessness that showed how disturbed he was. He needed to shut down his mind. Maybe a hot shower, maybe more whiskey. That's when he noticed it, a light on at the end of the hallway, in the service wing. He frowned. That area should be dark at this hour. Maybe Deborah had forgotten to turn something off before going to bed, or maybe there was an electrical problem. Concerned about the possibility of a short circuit, the apartment was old, despite the renovations, Jackson headed toward the light. His steps were silent on the Persian rug in the hallway. The closer he got, the more he noticed details. The door slightly ajar, the soft sound of running water, the delicate scent of lavender soap. His brain should have processed those signals, should have understood, should have stopped. But he was tired, distracted, worried about circuits and wires. He pushed the door open without knocking, the automatic action of someone accustomed to having unrestricted access to every inch of his property. Time froze. Deborah stood in the small room, her back to the door, a towel in her hands. She'd just stepped out of the tiny attached bathroom, wearing only simple cotton panties and a white bra. Her olive skin glistened wet under the harsh fluorescent light. Her hair, normally pulled back, fell in damp waves over her bare shoulders. Water droplets were sliding down the curve of her back, tracing paths that Jackson's eyes followed involuntarily. She sensed the presence, or perhaps heard his breathing, one which had stopped and restarted, irregular, shocked. Deborah turned sharply, eyes wide with terror and shame. For an instant, an eternal second, they just stared at each other. She, with one hand instinctively covering her chest, the other holding the towel she couldn't position fast enough. He, frozen in the doorway, with an expression that mixed shock, horror, and something else. Something he didn't want to name, but that burned in his chest like liquid fire. Time began moving again in slow motion. Jackson saw everything in that suspended moment. The raw vulnerability in her eyes, so different from the always controlled posture she maintained. The way her body trembled, not from cold but from exposure. The thin scar that cut across her left shoulder, speaking of some painful story from the past. The ribs, slightly prominent beneath her skin, evidence that she probably skipped meals to save money. And the beauty. God, her beauty. It wasn't the artificial beauty of the women who frequented his social events, with their bodies sculpted in luxury gyms and maintained by expensive surgeons. It was a real beauty, human, imperfect, and for that very reason devastating. Soft curves, skin marked by life, strength and fragility coexisting in every inch. Jackson's heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mouth was dry. His hands were shaking. Deborah's voice came out broken, a strangled whisper. I'm sorry, sir. I should have... She's apologizing. The realization hit Jackson like a slap. I invade her room and she's apologizing? No, he said, his voice coming out rougher, more urgent than he'd intended. He raised a hand as if he could physically interrupt her words. No, Deborah, no. God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought it was an electrical problem. I would never have. He took a step back, almost tripping over his own foot, desperate to put distance between them, to give her the space and dignity he'd violated. But before turning completely, his eyes met hers again. And what he saw there destroyed him. It wasn't anger, it wasn't accusation, it was fear. A deep and ancient fear that spoke of other times when she'd been vulnerable and someone had taken advantage of it. A fear that said she expected the worst from him now, because the worst was what she'd learned to expect from the world. "You're safe," Jackson said, with an intensity that surprised them both. "You're completely safe with me, Deborah. I swear. This was a terrible, unforgivable mistake, and I'm leaving now, I'm going. And tomorrow, if you want to leave, I completely understand. I'll pay 3 months' salary in advance and give you excellent references. You don't have to—" "Sir," she interrupted him, her voice still trembling, but with a thread of something stronger woven in. She'd managed to wrap the towel around her body, holding it tightly against her chest. "Please, just close the door." It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, practical request from someone who desperately needed privacy to pull herself together. Jackson nodded quickly, already turning. Yes, of course. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He closed the door gently, but in the last second before it closed completely, his eyes captured one final image. Deborah sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, shoulders curved, one hand pressed against her mouth, as if holding back a sob. Jackson stood outside the closed door, breathing heavily, heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned his forehead against the cold hallway wall, squeezed his eyes shut. What have I done? What the hell have I done? The image of her was engraved in his mind with painful clarity. The curve of her back, the water droplets, the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear, but also, and this shamed him deeply, the attraction. That overwhelming feeling of having seen something sacred, forbidden, unforgettable. As if a door had been opened inside him and could no longer be closed. He walked to his room in a trance, undressed mechanically, got in the shower. He turned on the cold water and stood under the icy stream until his teeth chattered, until the physical shock drowned out some of the emotional turmoil. But it didn't help. When he finally lay down on the king-size bed, staring at the dark ceiling, all he could see was her, and all he could feel was the crushing weight of guilt mixed with something far more dangerous, desire. On the other side of the apartment, locked in her small room, Deborah sat on the bed with her back against the wall, hugging her knees to her chest. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of shame or fear alone. They were tears of confusion, because when her eyes met his in that impossible moment, she didn't see just shock. She saw something else, something that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with terror, and that scared her more than anything else. Dawn came to Manhattan like a hesitant promise, honey-colored rays of sun cutting through the skyscrapers, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was the kind of morning that normally inspired poets and lovers, but inside Jackson Blake's penthouse, the atmosphere was one of impending storm. Jackson hadn't slept, not 1 minute. He'd spent the entire night tossing and turning in the Egyptian silk sheets, alternating between crushing guilt and the persistent image of Deborah that refused to leave his mind. At 5 in the morning, he gave up trying to sleep. He got up, made coffee that was too strong, and sat in the huge empty kitchen mentally rehearsing what he'd say to her. "Deborah, about last night." "No, too formal. I need you to know it was never my intention." Sounds like a politician's excuse. "I'm an idiot and you deserve so much more respect." True, but incomplete. At exactly 6 o'clock, he heard the key turning in the lock of the service door. His heart raced. Every muscle in his body contracted. He held the coffee cup so tightly his fingers turned white. Her footsteps were unmistakable, light, cautious, almost silent. But today there was a hesitation in them that hadn't been there before. She paused more. She took longer between rooms. Jackson forced himself to remain seated, not to rush to her. He needed to give her space. He needed to let her come to him in her own time. 15 minutes passed. 20. 30. He heard the sound of the coffee maker being turned on, cabinet doors being opened and closed with excessive delicacy. Everything very careful, everything very controlled, as if she were trying to be even more invisible than she'd always been. Finally, inevitably, she appeared in the kitchen entrance. Jackson looked up and nearly lost his breath. Deborah wore her impeccable uniform, the grey dress perfectly pressed, her hair pulled back in a bun even tighter than usual, as if she were trying to hide every inch of herself. But what devastated Jackson were her eyes. They were swollen. She'd been crying, probably all night. And now they avoided his with an almost physical determination. "Good morning, Mr. Blake." Her voice was a professional whisper, empty of any emotion. "May I prepare your breakfast?" The distance in those words cut Jackson like glass. "Deborah," he began, his own voice hoarse from exhaustion and contained emotion. "Please sit down. We need to talk." She stiffened, her fingers interlaced in front of her body, her knuckles turning white from the tension. "Sir, I prefer to maintain professionalism. I can bring your—" "Sit down," he repeated, but this time with a softness that transformed the request into a plea. "Please." Deborah hesitated for long seconds that felt like hours. Finally, with rigid movements, she walked to the table and sat on the edge of the chair, as if ready to run at any moment. She kept her eyes fixed on her own hands, which trembled slightly in her lap. The silence between them was thick, charged with everything that had happened the night before. Jackson could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. "What happened last night," he began, choosing each word with surgical care, "was completely my fault. There's no excuse, none. I invaded your privacy in the most brutal way possible and—" "Sir, you don't need to—" She tried to interrupt, but he gently raised his hand. "Please let me finish," he asked, and something in the tone of his voice, a raw vulnerability he rarely showed, made her finally raise her eyes to meet his. The impact of that direct gaze was like a punch. Jackson saw everything there. The pain, the shame, the fear, but he also saw something he didn't expect, a spark of defiance, as if she were gathering courage not to let herself be broken by this. "You did nothing wrong," Jackson continued, keeping his gaze fixed on hers, needing her to believe those words. "Nothing. You were in your room, in your private space. I'm the one who entered without permission, without knocking, without thinking. The mistake was mine, Deborah. Entirely and completely mine." She blinked rapidly, fighting against tears that threatened to overflow. "I should have locked the door," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I always lock it. But yesterday I was so tired and—" "No," Jackson interrupted firmly. "Don't do that. Don't take blame that isn't yours. You have every right to feel safe in this house, whether the door is locked or not. And I violated that. I betrayed your trust." A heavy silence fell between them. Deborah lowered her eyes again, but Jackson noticed her shoulders relaxed minimally, as if a small part of the weight had been lifted. "Mr. Blake," she said after a moment, her voice still low but firmer, "I need this job. My grandmother. She needs expensive medications, physical therapy. I can't afford to—" "You're not going to lose the job," Jackson cut in immediately. "Never. Unless it's your choice to leave. And if it is, I completely understand. But if you decide to stay, I guarantee nothing like this will happen again. You have my word." Deborah raised her eyes again, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she was searching his soul, looking for signs of lies, of manipulation, of the things she'd probably already experienced with other men in positions of power. "Why do you care?" she asked suddenly, the question coming out before she could stop it. I'm nobody. Most men in your position would have just moved on, or worse." The pain implicit in those words, "or worse," made Jackson's stomach turn. How many times had she been treated like nobody? How many times had men in positions of power taken advantage of her? "You're not nobody," he said, and there was an intensity in his voice that surprised them both. "You're... Deborah, since you got here, something changed. I can't explain exactly what, but this place feels less empty, less cold. And it's not because you arrange things well or make perfect coffee. It's you, your presence, the way you take care of everything with so much dedication. The strength I see in you every day." He paused, realizing he was revealing too much but unable to stop. "Last night when I saw you, it wasn't just—" He struggled to find the right words. "It wasn't just physical. It was seeing you, really seeing you. Vulnerable and human and beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with—" He stopped abruptly, realizing he was entering dangerous territory. Deborah stared at him now, eyes wide, lips parted. A blush rose to her cheeks. She seemed to be holding her breath. "I'm sorry," Jackson said quickly. "That was inappropriate. I wanted you to know that I see you. As a person. As someone who deserves respect and—" "No one has ever talked to me like that," Deborah interrupted him, her voice an astonished whisper. "No one has ever seen me. Not really." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of shame or fear. They were tears of something being awakened, an old hope she'd buried deeply. Jackson felt something shifting in the air between them. The tension was still there, but transformed. It was no longer just discomfort and guilt. It was something more complex, more charged. Without thinking completely about what he was doing, he extended his hand across the table, not to touch her, but as an invitation. A bridge. Deborah looked at that hand for long seconds. The hand of a billionaire CEO, impeccably cared for, extended to her, to the housekeeper, to the invisible woman. Hesitant, trembling slightly, she raised her own hand. Their fingers touched. It was the lightest possible contact. Just fingertips brushing. But the electricity that passed between them was devastating. Both felt it. Both gasped softly. Jackson felt the warmth of her skin, the softness despite hands calloused by work. Deborah felt the contained strength in that touch, but also the tenderness, the care. They stayed like that for eternal seconds, just fingertips connected, eyes locked on each other, breaths synchronized. Then Deborah, slowly, intertwined her fingers with his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." Jackson gently squeezed her hand, unable to form words. His heart was beating so hard he was certain she could hear it. In that moment, in the silence of that kitchen bathed in golden morning light, something fundamental changed between them. The walls were beginning to fall, and neither of them was sure if they were ready for what would come next. The days following that morning transformed into a delicate dance between two hearts, fighting against the inevitable gravity, pulling them toward each other. Jackson Blake, the man who controlled empires and commanded boardrooms with unwavering authority, found himself completely lost before something as simple as Deborah Williams' presence in his apartment. He began doing things he'd never done before, small, subtle changes to his meticulously planned routine, all orbiting around her. He started coming home earlier. He cancelled business dinners he would have previously considered essential. He invented excuses to stay in the apartment during the day, work in the home office, make calls he could easily make at the corporate office, review documents that didn't need urgent review, all to be able to see her, hear her voice, be in the same space she breathed. And Deborah, in turn, began to notice the changes. In the first week after that morning, she was still cautious, maintaining professional distance with almost desperate determination. But it was impossible to ignore the small gestures that began to appear. A book of poetry by Maya Angelou, that she'd mentioned loving just once in a brief conversation, appeared on the kitchen counter, wrapped in simple paper. No card, no signature. But she knew. Her worn shoes mysteriously disappeared from her room and, in their place, a new pair appeared. Simple, practical, comfortable, exactly her size. Along with it, a handwritten note in Jackson's elegant handwriting. "I noticed the old ones were hurting your feet. Please accept these, not as an employer, but as someone who cares." The refrigerator in the small back room, which had been almost empty before, began to be discreetly restocked with fresh fruit, yogurts, sandwiches prepared by Jackson's personal chef. Deborah knew he was behind this. She could tell by the way he averted his eyes when she tried to thank him, as if he was afraid she'd reject his kindness if it were explicitly acknowledged. And then there were the moments. Those moments suspended in time when they'd pass each other in the hallways and stop, just looking at each other. Seconds that stretched like elastic bands, charged with everything they didn't say. The air between them became dense, electric, vibrating with possibilities. One morning, Deborah was in the living room arranging the sofa pillows. Sunlight streamed through the enormous windows, creating golden patterns on the wooden floor. She hummed softly, a song in Spanish that her grandmother used to sing about love and longing. She didn't notice when Jackson entered. He stood frozen in the room's entrance, just watching. The way she moved was almost like a dance, each gesture precise, but fluid. The sunlight caught copper highlights in her dark hair. Her voice, low and soft, carried a sweet melancholy that squeezed Jackson's heart. She turned to adjust a flower vase and finally saw him. She stopped abruptly, an instant blush rising to her cheeks. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice slightly breathless from surprise. "I didn't hear you come in." "Don't stop," he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "The song. It was beautiful." Deborah lowered her eyes, her nervous fingers playing with the hem of her blouse. "My grandmother used to sing it to me when I was a child," she explained softly. "About a woman waiting for her love to return from the sea." "Does he come back?" Jackson asked, taking a step into the room, unable to maintain distance. Deborah raised her eyes to meet his, and there was something new there. An openness, a vulnerability she was beginning to allow him to see. "In the song?" "Yes. He comes back. But my grandmother always said the most important thing wasn't that he came back, but that she never stopped believing he would. Her faith was what kept her alive." "And you?" Jackson asked, now just a few steps away from her. "Do you have faith?" The question was deeper than the words suggested. They both knew it. Deborah held his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "I'm starting to," she whispered. The silence that followed was interrupted only by both of their breathing. Jackson felt his fingers tingle with the urge to reach for her, to touch her face, to brush away that rebellious strand of hair that had escaped from her bun. But he didn't. Not yet. This needed to be on her terms, in her time. "I have a meeting," he finally said, forcing himself to take a step back. "But would you have dinner with me tonight? Here. Nothing formal. Just talking." Deborah hesitated. He saw the internal war in her eyes, fear fighting with desire, caution battling hope. "I don't know if it's appropriate, sir," she said, but there was a note of longing in her voice that betrayed her words. "Forget appropriate," Jackson responded with sudden intensity. "Just for one night. Just be Deborah. And I'll just be Jackson, not employer and employee, just two people sharing a meal." She bit her lower lip, and the gesture nearly undid Jackson's resolve to maintain distance. "Okay," she agreed finally, so quietly he almost didn't hear. "But I'll cook." Jackson smiled, a genuine wide smile that transformed his entire face. Deborah felt her heart take a dangerous leap in her chest. Deal. That night, the penthouse kitchen transformed into something it had never been before. A home. Deborah insisted on cooking, and Jackson, breaking all the protocol rules he'd lived by for years, pulled up a chair and sat at the counter, watching. She prepared a traditional dish her grandmother had taught her, saffron chicken rice with cilantro and lemon, accompanied by creamy black beans and roasted vegetables. The kitchen filled with aromas that made Jackson's stomach growl, but more than that, it filled with life. Deborah worked with the grace of someone who finds joy in the act of creating. Her hands, those calloused hands he'd held the previous week, danced over the ingredients with confidence and love. She hummed softly as she cooked, occasionally commenting on each step. "My grandmother always said that food carries the energy of whoever cooks it," Deborah explained as she seasoned the chicken. "If you cook with anger, people will taste it. If you cook with love—" She paused, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. "People will taste that too. And what are you cooking with now?" Jackson asked, his voice low, intimate. Deborah smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "Hope," she answered simply. During dinner, seated at the enormous table that had never hosted such a simple and perfect meal, they talked. Really talked. Jackson spoke about his childhood, only child of workaholic parents who barely had time for him, raised by nannies in an empty mansion, building business empires as a way to fill the emptiness that was never filled with love. Deborah shared her story, growing up poor but rich in affection, raised only by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. She dreamed of being a nurse, had started college, but when her grandmother got sick, she had to leave everything to work and pay for treatments. "You'll go back," Jackson said with absolute conviction, "to college, to your dreams. I'll make sure of it." Deborah shook her head gently. "I don't want to be your charity project, Jackson." She used his first name for the first time, and the sound of it coming from her lips made something tighten in his chest. I want to earn things for myself. What if I'm not offering charity? He responded, leaning slightly over the table. What if I'm offering partnership? Believing in someone isn't charity, Deborah. It's investment. And I've always been good at recognizing potential. Their eyes locked. The candle between them at the center of the table cast dancing shadows on their faces. The apartment was silent, except for the soft sound of a jazz playlist Jackson had put on. Why me? Deborah asked, raw vulnerability in her voice. You could have any woman, models, executives, women from your world. Why the housekeeper? Jackson extended his hand across the table, stopping just inches from hers, close enough for her to feel the warmth, but far enough that it was her choice to close the distance. Because you're real, he said with fierce intensity. Because when you look at me, you don't just see the CEO or the bank account, you see me. Because your strength inspires me, because your smile. God, Deborah, your smile makes this whole place feel different, warmer, more alive. He paused, swallowing hard. Because when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether I'll see you. And when I go to sleep, the last image in my mind is you. And that scares me as much as it thrills me. Deborah was visibly trembling now. Tears shone in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Slowly, as if making the most important decision of her life, she moved her hand across the table and intertwined her fingers with his. The touch was electric. They both felt the current pass between them, intensified by the vulnerability they'd shared. Me too, she whispered. I think about you too, all the time, and I don't know what to do with it. Jackson gently squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. You don't need to know now, he said. Just stay, here, in this moment, with me. And she stayed. They remained at the table for hours, hands intertwined, talking about everything and nothing, about dreams and fears, about the past that had shaped them and the future they seemed for the first time able to imagine together. When they finally stood up, it was past midnight. Jackson insisted on helping her wash the dishes, something he'd never done in his life. They stood side by side at the sink, their shoulders occasionally touching, sending waves of warmth through both of them. They laughed at silly jokes. They shared comfortable silences. They existed, simply, in each other's space. When they finished, Deborah turned to him, their bodies dangerously close in the now silent kitchen. Thank you, she said, her eyes shining. For tonight, for seeing me. Jackson raised his hand slowly, giving her all the time in the world to pull back. When she didn't, he gently touched her face, his fingers caressing her cheek with a reverence that took her breath away. It's you who lets me see, he whispered. It's you who's bringing light to this dark place. Deborah closed her eyes, leaning into his touch like a flower seeking the sun. And in that moment they both knew. This was just the beginning of something that would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since that dinner. 3 weeks of an increasingly intimate dance between two hearts, fighting against all the rules of the world around them. Jackson and Deborah had developed their own routine, shared dinners when he came home, conversations that stretched into the early morning hours, glances that lasted a few seconds too long to be casual. Their fingers touched frequently now, always seeming to find excuses, passing the salt, reaching for the same book, adjusting a pillow. But they still hadn't crossed certain lines. There were no kisses, no explicit confessions of feelings, just that growing tension, that desire that pulsed in the air between them like a living heart. Until that Thursday. Jackson had spent the entire day restless. An idea had formed in his mind during a particularly boring meeting, and the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that he needed to do it. He knew, through casual conversations, that Deborah loved classical music. Her grandmother had raised her listening to the great symphonies, Beethoven, Mozart, Tchaikovsky. She'd spoken with shining eyes about an old dream of attending a live performance at the New York Philharmonic, a dream that seemed as distant as the stars. Jackson made a call, then another. He used connections he rarely activated for personal favors, and he achieved the impossible. 2 tickets to a concert that had been sold out for months, a special performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, conducted by a world-renowned maestro. When he arrived home that night, he found Deborah in the living room, folding towels with the meticulous precision that characterized everything she did. The soft evening light came through the windows, creating golden halos around her. "Deborah," he said, and something in his tone made her immediately look up, her hands freezing on the soft fabric. "Did something happen?" she asked, instant concern crossing her face. "No, no," Jackson hurried to reassure her, walking to where she stood. "Actually, I have something for you." He extended his hand, revealing 2 golden tickets. Deborah looked at them for a moment, not understanding. Then her eyes widened when she read the printed words. "Jackson, this is..." Her voice failed. "This is for the Philharmonic, for Beethoven, but this has been sold out for months. I saw it on the website. I want you to come with me," he interrupted gently. "Tomorrow night. Not as my employee. As my guest. As someone I'd like to share this with." Deborah looked at the tickets, then at him, then back at the tickets. Her hands were visibly trembling. Tears began to form in her eyes. "I can't accept this," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's too expensive, it's..." "Deborah." Jackson took a step closer, his voice low and intense. "How many times are you going to let the world tell you that you don't deserve beautiful things? You deserve them. You deserve music, beauty, joy. You deserve to have your dreams come true." A tear ran down her cheek. Jackson, moved by an instinct that defied all his usual restraint, raised his hand and gently wiped it away with his thumb. The touch was like spark to gunpowder. They both froze, eyes locked, breath suspended. "Say yes," he asked, his voice hoarse. "Please." Deborah closed her eyes for a long moment, fighting with something internal. When she opened them again, there was determination there, a decision made. "Yes," she whispered, "but I don't have anything to wear. Nothing appropriate for a place like that." Jackson smiled, that genuine smile that completely transformed his face. "Leave that to me." The following afternoon, 3 elegant boxes arrived at Deborah's room, discreetly delivered by a luxury boutique. Inside were 3 evening dresses, simple but exquisitely elegant, in colors that Jackson somehow knew would be perfect on her. Deep navy blue, emerald green, and classic black, each accompanied by delicate shoes and a silk shawl. A handwritten card was attached. "Choose whichever makes you feel most like yourself. I'm not trying to change you. I just want you to shine the way I always knew you could. Jay." Deborah touched the fabrics with reverence, almost afraid to stain them. She'd never owned anything so fine, so beautiful. Part of her wanted to refuse, to shout that it was too much, that she was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. But another part, a part that had been asleep for so long, wanted this, wanted to feel beautiful, wanted to be seen not as the housekeeper, but as a woman, wanted to have a magical night with the man who, against all logic, had captured her heart. She chose the navy blue. When Deborah came downstairs at 7 o'clock, Jackson was waiting in the entrance hall, adjusting the cuffs of his white shirt beneath his impeccable tuxedo. He looked up when he heard her footsteps and literally lost his breath. The navy blue dress flowed over her body like water, accentuating every curve with understated elegance. The neckline was modest, but revealed the graceful line of her collarbone. Her hair, normally pulled back, fell in soft waves over her shoulders, framing her face. She'd worn minimal makeup, just enough to enhance the depth of her brown eyes and the natural rosy tone of her lips. But it wasn't the dress or the makeup that stole Jackson's breath. It was the way she moved, with a shy but genuine grace. It was the vulnerability in her eyes as she descended each step. It was the hesitant, hopeful smile that curved her lips. "You're..." Jackson began, but the words died in his throat. No words in any language seemed adequate. Deborah stopped on the last step, her nervous hands smoothing the fabric of the dress. "Is it okay?" she asked, insecurity coloring her voice. "I've never worn anything like this. I don't know if..." "You're absolutely stunning," Jackson finally managed to say, his voice hoarse with genuine emotion. "Deborah, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." The blush that rose to her cheeks made her even more beautiful. She lowered her eyes, but she was smiling. a real, radiant smile that lit up the entire room. Jackson extended his arm. "Ready?" Deborah hesitated for just a second before sliding her hand into his arm. The contact, even through layers of clothing, sent waves of warmth through both of them. "Ready," she whispered. Lincoln Center was magnificent under the nightlights, its fountains dancing in illuminated choreography. As Jackson's driver left them at the entrance, Deborah looked around with wide eyes, trying to absorb every detail: the elegantly dressed people climbing the steps, the grand architecture, the vibrant energy of cultural anticipation. Jackson wasn't watching the building, but her. The childlike joy on her face, the way her eyes sparkled, how she gently squeezed his arm each time she saw something new and wonderful. When was the last time I really saw something for the first time, he thought. When did I stop being amazed? She was teaching him to see again. Inside the auditorium, their seats were perfect. Orchestra section, center, where every note would be felt as much as heard. Deborah touched the red velvet of the seats with reverence, looked up at the ornate ceiling, at the crystal chandeliers casting golden light over everything. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she whispered, turning to Jackson with pure gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for this." Jackson took her hand, in front of everyone, not caring who might see or comment. "Thank you," he responded, "for reminding me that beauty exists." The lights dimmed, the orchestra entered, and when the conductor raised his baton, the entire world disappeared. The music was transcendent. The strings wept and sang, the brass proclaimed ancient truths, the percussion echoed like heartbeats. Beethoven had composed that symphony when he was already completely deaf, creating beauty he could never hear, only feel. Jackson glanced at Deborah and saw tears silently streaming down her cheeks. She didn't try to hide them. She was completely lost in the music, in the moment, in the pure emotion. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. She immediately intertwined her fingers with his, squeezing hard, as if he were an anchor in a sea of overwhelming feelings. They stayed like that, hands intertwined, shoulders touching, sharing that moment of perfect beauty, while the music enveloped them like a divine embrace. During the final movement, when the choir began to sing Ode to Joy, Deborah squeezed Jackson's hand so hard that his fingers turned white. He turned to look at her and saw that she was completely transported, crying openly now, her face a mixture of joy, pain, gratitude, and something more, something deep and transformative. He pressed his lips to her temple in a soft, instinctive kiss that lasted only a second, but seemed to change the gravity of the universe. When the music finally ended and applause exploded, Deborah turned to him, tears still wetting her cheeks, eyes shining like stars. "I'll never forget this," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Never. As long as I live, I'll remember this night. You. This moment." Jackson wiped her tears with his thumbs, holding her face in his hands. "Neither will I," he promised. "Neither will I." In the car on the way home, the silence between them was dense, electric. Sitting in the back seat, their bodies gravitated toward each other. First, their shoulders touched, then, almost involuntarily, their hands found each other in the space between them. Fingers intertwined, without words, without permission, asked or granted. Just the inevitable need for connection. Jackson looked at their joined hands, his pale skin against hers, olive and warm. The difference and the similarity. The strange perfection of how they fit together. Deborah followed his gaze and smiled softly. With her free hand, she traced his knuckles, exploring every line, every texture. "Strong hands," she murmured, "but gentle." "Yours too," he responded, turning her hand over, tracing the lines of her palm. "These hands have worked so hard, cared for so much, carried so much weight." He pressed a soft kiss to the center of her palm. Deborah closed her eyes, gasping softly at the intimate gesture. When they arrived at the building, neither wanted the night to end. They rode up in the private elevator in silence, still holding hands, the air between them vibrating with anticipation. The doors opened to the penthouse. They entered together, and the door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo through eternity. Deborah turned to face him, the soft light from the city coming through the windows, creating halos around both of them. "Jackson," she began, her voice trembling. But before she could continue, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. And then, finally, inevitably, everything changed. The penthouse was wrapped in intimate twilight, only the city lights filtering through the enormous windows, creating patterns of shadows and brightness that danced softly across the marble walls. The silence was profound, broken only by the racing heartbeats of two hearts that had finally stopped fighting against the inevitable. Jackson and Deborah stood just inches apart, on the threshold between everything they had been and everything they were about to become. Both their breathing was irregular, shallow, charged with anticipation. "Deborah," Jackson whispered, his voice hoarse, almost broken. "If you want to stop, if this is too fast, I'll understand. We can just—" She placed two fingers on his lips, silencing him. Her eyes, those deep brown eyes that had carried so much care and caution for so long, now shone with a determination he'd never seen before. "Don't talk," she whispered. "Please don't talk. I've spent my whole life being careful, being practical, protecting my heart. Tonight I just want to feel." The raw vulnerability in those words destroyed Jackson's last defenses. With reverent softness, as if she were something precious and fragile, he raised his hand and brushed away a strand of hair that had fallen over her face, tucking it gently behind her ear. His fingers lingered there, tracing the line of her jaw, the contour of her cheek. Deborah closed her eyes at his touch, leaning into it like a flower seeking the sun. A soft sigh escaped her parted lips. "You're so beautiful," Jackson murmured, his voice loaded with genuine admiration. "So incredibly beautiful." Deborah opened her eyes slowly, and what he saw there nearly knocked him down. Desire, yes, but also trust. She was giving herself to him, not just her body, but her vulnerability, her fears, her hope. With deliberate care, giving her all the time in the world to change her mind, Jackson leaned in. His lips hovered over hers for an eternal second, sharing the same breath, the same space, the same suspended moment. And then, finally, they touched. The kiss began soft, almost shy. Lips exploring lips with a tenderness that bordered on reverence, a silent acknowledgement that this was important, that this meant something. But then something changed. The fire that had been burning low between them for weeks suddenly ignited into flames. Deborah let out a soft moan against his mouth, her hands rising to grip the lapels of his tuxedo. Jackson responded by deepening the kiss, his tongue tracing the contour of her lips, asking permission. She granted it immediately, opening to him, meeting him with equal urgency. His hands found her waist, pulling her against him. She melted into his embrace, their bodies finally aligning the way they'd been craving for so long. He could feel every curve of her pressed against him, her warmth through the thin layers of fabric. Deborah wrapped her arms around his neck, fingers sliding through his hair, undoing the perfect order. He groaned against her lips, the sound reverberating through both of them. The kiss became deeper, more desperate. Months of unresolved tension, of repressed desires, of denied connection, all exploding in that moment. They kissed as if they were dying of thirst and each was the other's spring. Jackson walked backward, guiding her without breaking the kiss, until her back touched the cold wall. Deborah gasped at the contrast, the icy marble against her back, the burning heat of Jackson pressed against her front. He dragged his lips along the line of her jaw, down her neck, finding that sensitive spot where her pulse beat frantically. He pressed his mouth there, feeling the living proof of how she affected him. "Jackson," she moaned, her head tilting back against the wall, giving him more access. "Please." He raised his head, searching for her eyes in the twilight. "Please what?" he asked, his voice hoarse with desire but also with care. "Tell me, I need to hear you say it." Deborah held his face in her hands, forcing him to really see her, to witness the truth in her eyes. "I want you," she said, clear and firm, without shame or hesitation. "My whole life I've done what was expected, what was safe. But tonight, I want this. I want you, completely." The raw confession broke something fundamental in Jackson. With a groan that was half relief, half surrender, he swept her up in his arms, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back, and carried her through the dark apartment. Deborah clung to him, her face buried in the curve of his neck, breathing in his scent, something woody and musky that was uniquely his. She pressed soft kisses there, feeling his pulse race beneath her lips. Jackson's bedroom was as minimalist as the rest of the apartment. Huge bed with impeccable white sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the illuminated city, dark and elegant furniture. But none of that mattered. The only piece of furniture that existed for them in that moment was the bed. Jackson set her down gently beside it, his eyes never leaving hers. With hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness but from contained emotion, he reached for the zipper at the back of her dress. "May I?" he asked, always asking permission, always giving her power. "Yes," she whispered. The sound of the zipper descending seemed loud in the silence. Jackson pulled it slowly, revealing her olive skin inch by inch. When he finished, the dress slipped from her shoulders and fell to the floor like water, forming a navy blue pool at her feet. Deborah stood before him in simple lingerie. No expensive lace or imported silks, just basic white cotton. But to Jackson, she'd never looked more perfect, because it was real. It was her. "You take my breath away," he murmured, his eyes tracing every curve, every contour, memorizing her. Deborah, feeling a courage she didn't know she possessed, reached for his tie and began loosening it. Her fingers worked on the buttons of his shirt, revealing his defined chest, the pale skin over firm muscles. When she placed her palms over his heart, feeling it beat hard and fast, Jackson covered her hands with his. "This is what you do to me," he said. "My heart has never beaten like this. Not for business, not for achievements, not for anything. Only for you." Deborah stretched up, capturing his lips again. This time, the kiss was slower, deeper, more intentional. They moved to the bed, lying down together, bodies intertwined. Jackson explored her as if he had all the time in the world, his hands tracing paths of fire across her skin, his mouth following, kissing every place his fingers touched. He memorized the way she gasped when he kissed her neck, the sound she made when his fingers traced the curve of her waist, the way she trembled when he whispered her name against her skin. Deborah, in turn, discovered him with equal reverence. Her fingers explored the muscles of his back, the lines of his shoulders, the contained strength in every inch of him. She kissed him with a hunger that surprised her, a hunger not just physical, but emotional, spiritual. When they finally joined together, it was with deliberate slowness, eyes open, looking into each other's eyes, witnessing the moment they became one. Deborah gasped, her hands gripping his shoulders. Jackson froze, immediate concern crossing his face. "Are you okay? Did I hurt you?" "No," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "You didn't hurt me. You made me feel whole." They moved together in a dance as old as time, but that seemed invented only for them. Every touch was intentional. Every kiss a promise, every whisper a confession. "You're amazing," Jackson murmured against her skin. "So beautiful, so perfect." "You make me feel seen," Deborah responded, her lips finding his between words. "For the first time, I feel seen." The pleasure built between them like a symphony, slow at first, then growing, intensifying, until both were swept up by a wave that left them trembling and breathless in each other's arms. In the afterglow, lying intertwined beneath the rumpled sheets, with the city blinking like stars through the windows, they simply existed. Jackson traced lazy patterns on her back. Deborah rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I don't want this night to end," she whispered. Jackson kissed the top of her head, pulling her closer against him. "Then we won't let it," he responded. "This doesn't have to end, Deborah. We can make this be the beginning." She raised her head to look at him, vulnerability and hope mixed in her gaze. "Of what?" "Of everything," he said simply, with a certainty that surprised even himself. "Of us." And in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms, with the night keeping their secrets and the city as a silent witness, they believed. They believed the impossible was possible, that love could cross any barriers, that maybe, just maybe, they could have their happily ever after. Morning arrived with a soft golden light that flooded the room like a hesitant promise. Deborah woke first, disoriented for a moment, until the reality of where she was and who she was with flooded her consciousness like a warm wave. She was lying on Jackson's chest, the silk sheets tangled around both of them, his arm firmly around her waist, even in sleep. Her heart raced as she remembered the previous night, every touch, every kiss, every word whispered in the dark. What have I done? It wasn't regret she felt. It was something more complex, a mixture of joy, fear, uncertainty, and a hope so intense it almost hurt. She'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She'd given herself completely to a man who technically was still her employer. And now? What happens now? Jackson stirred beneath her, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her back, even before fully opening his eyes. When he finally did, and his grey eyes met hers, he smiled. A slow, genuine smile, full of tenderness. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice hoarse with sleep. "Good morning," she replied shyly, suddenly conscious of her own nakedness, the overwhelming intimacy of the situation. Jackson must have sensed her tension because his expression immediately changed to concern. He adjusted himself, sitting up against the headboard and pulling her so she was nestled against him, the sheet carefully arranged around both of them. "Hey," he said softly, lifting her chin so she'd look at him. "What's going on in that beautiful head?" Deborah bit her lower lip, struggling with the words. "I just don't know what this means. What we are now. How this works when Monday comes, and I'm still your housekeeper and you're still—" "Stop," Jackson interrupted, but gently. "We need to talk about this. Seriously, can you get dressed? I'll make coffee and we can have a real conversation in the right place." There was something in his tone, a seriousness, a determination, that both reassured and frightened her. 30 minutes later, they were sitting in the living room, dressed casually, he in jeans and a simple t-shirt, she in one of the blouses he'd insisted she borrow. Steaming cups of coffee sat on the table between them. Jackson looked nervous, which was surprising for someone who commanded boardrooms with billions at stake. He ran his hand through his hair several times, cleared his throat, then finally turned to face her completely. "Deborah, I need to say something important, and I need you to hear me out before you react. Can you do that?" Fear chilled her stomach, but she nodded. "I terminated your contract," he said all at once, and before panic could fully settle on her face, he raised his hands. "Let me explain. Please." Deborah was paralyzed, her fingers gripping the coffee cup so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jackson leaned forward, his expression intense, desperate for her to understand. "Last night it was the most important night of my life, and I woke up this morning knowing I can't continue this way. I can't be with you, love you while you work for me. It's wrong. The power imbalance is wrong. Jackson, I need this job," Deborah began, panic now evident in her voice. "My grandmother, the medications, I can't—" "I know," he interrupted gently, "and that's why I spent the last hour on the phone with my HR department and my lawyers. Deborah, I want to offer you something different, something real." He picked up a folder that was on the side table and opened it, revealing carefully prepared documents. "My company is launching a new corporate social responsibility program. We're creating initiatives for entry-level employees, better wages, subsidized education, healthcare, growth opportunities. And I want you to lead this project." Deborah looked at him, completely stunned. What? Jackson, I don't have the qualifications to—" "You have the only qualifications that matter," he said with fierce conviction. "You've lived it. You know what it's like to struggle, to work yourself to exhaustion, to choose between food and medicine. You have empathy, intelligence, and a work ethic that puts any executive I know to shame." He pushed the documents toward her. "This is a real contract. Consultant salary, full benefits including health coverage, for you and your grandmother. I'll pay for you to go back to college if you want. And most importantly, you won't be working for me. You'll be working with the company, reporting directly to the board." Deborah looked at the papers, the words blurring through the tears that filled her eyes. The numbers she saw seemed unreal, more than she would have earned in years at her previous position. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Jackson moved to sit beside her on the couch, taking her hands. "Because I can't love you while you depend on me financially. Because I want us to be equals. Because if you choose to stay with me, I need to know it's because you want to, not because you need to. He squeezed her hands, raw vulnerability on his face. I love you, Deborah, he confessed, his voice breaking with emotion. I know it's fast. I know it's crazy. But I spent 38 years building walls, and you tore them all down in just a few weeks. You made me feel alive again. You made me want to be better. And I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. But only if it's your free choice. Deborah was openly crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks without restraint. You love me? She repeated as if unable to process the words. Desperately, he responded without hesitation, completely, irreversibly. But what if I fail? She asked, old fear resurfacing. What if I don't know how to do this job? What if I disappoint you? Jackson wiped away her tears with his thumbs, holding her face in his hands. Impossible, he said firmly. You're incapable of disappointing me. And as for failing, Deborah, I built a billion-dollar empire. I know how to recognize potential. You have something no MBA can teach. You have heart, and that's what this project needs. He paused, studying her face. But I need you to know, this isn't conditional on what happens between us. Even if you decide you don't want me romantically, the job is yours if you want it, because you deserve it, regardless of me. The generosity, the fairness, the implicit respect in those words broke down Deborah's last defenses. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his chest, not from sadness but from relief, gratitude, and overwhelming love. I love you, she said between sobs. God help me, I love you too. I was so afraid to feel this, to admit it. But I love you. Jackson held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, his own face wet with tears. Then say yes, he pleaded. To the job, to us, to a chance to build something real together. Deborah pulled back just enough to look at him, wiping her own face with trembling hands. Yes, she said, her voice firmer now. Yes to everything, but with one condition. Jackson raised an eyebrow, waiting. I pay for my own apartment, she said with determination. Even if it's tiny. I need to know I can stand on my own. I need to prove that to myself. Jackson studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly, respecting her need for autonomy. But if you need anything, for your grandmother, for yourself, you tell me. Not as a boss or a savior, but as the man who loves you and wants to help. Deal? Deal, she whispered. They sealed the agreement with a kiss, long, deep, full of promises and possibilities. When they finally separated, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. You know society is going to have opinions, he said softly. About us. About how we started. It's going to be hard sometimes. Deborah smiled, a strong, defiant, beautiful smile. I've spent my whole life being invisible, she said, being underestimated. If now people are going to talk about me because I found love and opportunity, let them talk. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's all that matters. Jackson kissed her again, admiration and love shining in his eyes. You're extraordinary, he murmured against her lips. No, she responded, smiling. I'm just finally allowing myself to be who I always was. And in that moment, sitting together in the apartment that no longer felt cold, but rather like the beginning of a home, they both knew they'd made the right decision. The rules had changed, and the game now was to play for the life they wanted to build together. The following 3 months were a roller coaster of transformations, challenges and discoveries that tested and strengthened Deborah and Jackson in ways neither of them could have predicted. Deborah moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn, a modest but bright studio, with windows overlooking a tree that changed colors with the seasons. It wasn't luxurious, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture she chose, every decoration she hung on the wall, every dish she bought, everything was a silent affirmation of her newly won independence. Jackson respected her space with a discipline that surprised even himself. He didn't show up unannounced. He didn't try to secretly pay her bills. He didn't smother her with expensive gifts. Instead, he truly courted her. With simple dinners he cooked himself, disastrously, but with so much effort she couldn't stop laughing. With long walks through Central Park, with nights watching movies on her tiny couch, their bodies intertwined under a warm blanket. He learned that loving Deborah didn't mean saving her or fixing her. It meant standing beside her while she saved herself. The work at Blake Tech Solutions was, initially, intimidating. On the first day, Deborah entered the glass and steel building feeling like an imposter. Everyone around her seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Executives in expensive suits, efficient assistants with tablets, people speaking corporate jargon she barely understood. Her office was small, but it had a window. She stood there for long minutes that first morning, looking at the city below, fighting the voice in her head that whispered, "You don't belong here. You're just the former housekeeper. They all know, they're all judging." A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. A woman in her 50s with grey hair pulled back in an elegant bun and kind eyes behind red-framed glasses entered with 2 coffees. "Deborah Williams?" she asked with a warm smile. "I'm Margaret Chen, Director of Human Resources. I thought you could use a coffee on your first day." Deborah accepted the cup with trembling hands. "Thank you. I'm a little nervous." Margaret sat in the chair across from her desk, crossing her legs casually. "You know what Jackson told me when he proposed this project?" she asked, her eyes studying Deborah with genuine curiosity. "He said, 'Margaret, we hire people with Harvard MBAs who don't know the difference between a spreadsheet and a real life. Deborah has lived in the world we're trying to improve. She's exactly who we need.'" Deborah blinked, surprised. "He said that?" "Word for word," Margaret confirmed. "And you know what? He's right. Most of our social responsibility initiatives fail because they're designed by people who've never experienced real hardship. You bring something no degree can teach, authentic empathy." That conversation was the first of many that helped Deborah find her place. She threw herself into the work with fierce determination. She spent hours interviewing entry-level employees, cleaning staff, security, maintenance, reception. She listened to their stories, their struggles, their deferred dreams, and in every face she saw herself from months ago. She created bold proposals, base salary increases, expanded health coverage, scholarship program for employees and their children, subsidized on-site daycare, flexible hours for single parents. Some board members initially resisted, questioning the costs. It was in one of those tense meetings that Deborah discovered her own voice. She was sitting in a cavernous conference room, surrounded by executives in $3,000 suits, looking at her with poorly disguised skepticism. The CFO, a man named Richard with perfectly styled grey hair, was questioning her numbers. "Ms. Williams, with all due respect, you're proposing we increase our operational costs by almost 15%. How do you justify this investment?" Deborah felt all eyes on her. Her first instinct was to shrink, apologize, back down. But then she thought of all the people she'd interviewed. Of Maria, the 60-year-old cleaning woman with arthritis who couldn't afford medication. Of James, the security guard who worked 3 jobs to support his children. Of everyone who depended on her to be brave. She stood up, walking to the whiteboard. "You want numbers?" she said, her voice firmer than expected. "I'll give you numbers. Our turnover rate in entry-level positions is 67% annually. It costs on average $50,000 to recruit and train each replacement. That's millions wasted every year." She began writing, her handwriting clear and precise. "If we implement these changes, studies show we can reduce turnover to 20%. That saves money, but more importantly," she turned to face them, "happy, healthy, valued employees are 30% more productive. They get sick less. They miss work less. They work better." Richard started to interrupt, but she raised her hand. "And you know what else?" she continued, passion entering her voice. "This is morally right. These people keep this building running. They clean your offices, protect your lives, serve your coffee. They deserve dignity, they deserve security. Not as charity, but as a basic human right." The silence that followed was thick. Deborah thought maybe she'd gone too far, that her tone had been inappropriate. Then Margaret began to clap. Slowly at first, then with more enthusiasm. Others joined in. Not everyone. Richard and a few others remained with closed expressions, but enough. Jackson, sitting discreetly in the corner of the room, he made a point not to sit at the head of the table in meetings about her project, so it wouldn't seem like he was supervising, looked at her with a mixture of admiration and pride that made her heart squeeze. After the meeting, when everyone had left, he approached her. "You were incredible," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I was shaking inside," she admitted, smiling nervously. "You couldn't tell," he responded, taking her hand. "You were... God, Deborah, you were magnificent, powerful. I could barely breathe watching you." She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I just channeled my grandmother. She always said, 'Mija, when you're speaking the truth, you don't need to shout. The truth has its own volume.'" Jackson pulled her into a hug, right there in the middle of the empty conference room. "I love you so much," he murmured against her hair. "Watching you grow, find your strength, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Weekends became sacred for them. Saturdays were for Deborah's grandmother. Jackson always went along, bringing flowers and the Belgian chocolates the lady loved. At first, the grandmother had been cautious with him, her wise eyes studying him with skepticism, looking for signs of falseness or hidden intentions. But Jackson won her over with patience and sincerity. He'd sit beside her bed, listening to stories of Puerto Rico, of her youth, of how she'd raised Deborah alone. He asked about traditional recipes and actually took notes. He discreetly arranged for her to have the best medical care, but made it seem like Deborah's insurance covered it, preserving the family's pride. One Saturday, while Deborah was in the kitchen making tea, the grandmother held Jackson's hand with her thin, trembling fingers. "You really love her," she said. It wasn't a question. "With every fiber of my being," Jackson responded without hesitation. "Good," the lady said, her eyes filling with tears. "Because she deserves to be loved like that. She deserves someone who sees her light. You see it, yes?" "I see it," Jackson promised, his own voice choked. "She's the most extraordinary person I've ever met." The grandmother nodded, satisfied. "Then you take care of her heart, and she'll take care of yours." Sundays were just for them. Sometimes they stayed in her apartment, cooking together, laughing at Jackson's culinary disasters, making love lazily under the light filtered through cheap curtains. Other times they explored the city like tourists, the High Line, the Brooklyn Bridge, small cafes in Williamsburg. Jackson discovered there was a whole New York he'd never seen, despite having lived there for decades. Deborah showed him her world: street food, live music in parks, underground galleries. One rainy Sunday afternoon, lying on her tiny couch, Deborah traced lazy patterns on Jackson's chest while rain drummed against the window. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Jackson captured her hand, intertwining their fingers, and brought it to his lips to kiss each knuckle. "I didn't even know what real happiness was until you," he answered honestly. "I thought it was success, achievements, numbers in a bank account. But this..." He squeezed her hand. "You, us, here in this tiny apartment where I barely fit on the couch. This is real happiness." Deborah smiled, her eyes shining. "Me too," she whispered. "For the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving. I'm living." They kissed, slow and deep, savoring the taste of coffee and promises. And outside, the city continued its frenetic rhythm. But inside that small apartment, time stopped. And it was perfect. 1 year had passed since that fateful night, when Jackson opened the wrong door and found much more than he expected. 1 year of transformations, growth, overcome challenges, and a love that deepened with each day. Deborah's social responsibility program had become a model within Blake Tech Solutions. The turnover rate had plummeted, productivity had soared, but more importantly, lives had changed. Maria, the cleaning woman with arthritis, now had complete medical coverage and was doing physical therapy. James, the security guard, had managed to cut down to just one job and was spending evenings at home with his children. Dozens of employees had started college courses through the scholarship program, and Deborah had become a respected voice in the company, no longer seen as the CEO's former housekeeper, but as a visionary leader who deeply understood what it meant to balance profit with humanity. Her grandmother was stable, her treatments showing positive results. The Brooklyn apartment had transformed into a real home, full of plants, photographs, and memories. And Jackson had become her best friend, her confidant, her love. But on that spring Saturday morning, something was different. Jackson had invited her to dinner at the penthouse, something they rarely did anymore, preferring the coziness of her apartment or discreet restaurants where they could just be a normal couple, but he insisted, saying he had a surprise. When Deborah arrived at 7 in the evening, wearing a simple ivory dress that Jackson loved, she found the door open. She entered cautiously, calling for him. "I'm up here." His voice came from above, from the rooftop garden she didn't even know existed. She climbed the spiral staircase that led to the terrace, and when she emerged, completely lost her breath. The rooftop had been transformed into an absolutely magical hanging garden. Hundreds of fairy lights were strung between pergolas covered in ivy. There were flower beds everywhere, roses, lilies, jasmine, and in the center, a perfect circle of her favorite flowers, sunflowers. Candles floated in glass vases, creating soft romantic lighting. A small table was set with candles and crystal glasses, and in the middle of it all stood Jackson. He wore dark pants and a white shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, the wind slightly tousling his hair. But what completely captured Deborah was the expression on his face. Pure vulnerability, intense love, and something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. "Jackson," she whispered, her hands covering her mouth. What is all this?" He walked to her, taking her hands in his. They were trembling. "You're shaking," she observed, concern coloring her voice. "I'm terrified," he admitted with a crooked smile. "I've never done this before." "Done what?" Instead of answering, he guided her to the center of the circle of sunflowers. The view of Manhattan was spectacular around them, the illuminated skyline like a necklace of jewels, the sky tinged with purples and pinks from the sunset. "Deborah," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "a year ago I was alone in this apartment, looking at this city, feeling empty. I had everything the world says should make me happy. Success, money, power. But I didn't have anything that really mattered." He squeezed her hands, his eyes never leaving hers. "And then I made a mistake. I opened the wrong door. And I found you. And Deborah, my entire life changed in that moment. You gave me purpose. You taught me what really matters. You made me want to be better, do better, live better." Tears began streaming down Deborah's face. She already knew where this was going, but could hardly believe it. "Watching you grow, find your strength, become who you were always meant to be. It's been the greatest honor of my life," Jackson continued, his own voice breaking, "and I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, not as your savior or mentor or anything other than your partner, your equal, your best friend, your love." He released one of her hands and, with movements that seemed to happen in slow motion, knelt on one knee. Deborah sobbed, her legs nearly giving out. She covered her face with her hands, crying openly now. Jackson took a small velvet box from his pocket. When he opened it, it revealed a ring that took Deborah's breath away, not because it was ostentatiously expensive or large, but because it was perfectly her. A simple and elegant diamond, set in rose gold, surrounded by small stones that caught the light like dewdrops. "Deborah Williams," Jackson said, tears now flowing freely down his own face. "You gave me back my soul. You taught me what it means to truly live, truly love. You're the bravest, kindest, most extraordinary person I've ever met, and I want to spend every day of the rest of my life making you happy, supporting your dreams, laughing with you, growing with you." He paused, swallowing hard, his voice coming out in a whisper loaded with emotion. "Will you marry me? Not for everything I have, but for everything we are together. Will you build a life with me where we're partners in everything, in love, in dreams, in challenges, in joys?" Deborah could barely see through the tears. She knelt in front of him, holding his face in her trembling hands. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Jackson let out a deep sigh of relief, as if there had been any chance she'd say no. With trembling hands, he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made to be there. And then they kissed, there in the middle of the sunflowers, surrounded by the city that had watched them fall into a love that defied all expectations. It was a kiss salty with tears, deep with promises, soft with tenderness. When they finally separated, both laughing through the tears, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I was so nervous," he admitted, I spent 2 weeks planning this. I changed the garden design 3 times. I rehearsed the speech 1,000 times. It was perfect, Deborah whispered. You're perfect, this is perfect. She looked around, marveling. You did all this for me? For us, he corrected. This will be our special place, where we'll come back every year to remember where we started and celebrate how much we've grown. Deborah looked at the ring on her finger, the stones catching the candlelight like tiny stars. My grandmother is going to be so happy, she said, laughing through new tears. She asks every week when you're going to ask the right question. Jackson laughed, the sound light and genuine. She knew. I asked for her blessing 3 weeks ago. I took the ring for her to approve. She cried and made me promise 3 things. Always make you smile, always listen to your heart, and always make your coffee the way you like it. You asked for her blessing? Deborah was crying again. Jackson, she's your family, he said simply. And soon she'll be mine too. It was important to me to honor her that way. Deborah pulled him into another kiss, this one deeper, loaded with gratitude, love, and promises of a future together. They had dinner under the stars, talking about everything. What the wedding would be like, intimate, meaningful, not ostentatious. Where they would live, they'd decide together, maybe a house where they could have a real garden. Their dreams for the future. Continue the social responsibility work, eventually expand to other companies, maybe one day have children. The night deepened, but neither wanted it to end. They danced slowly among the sunflowers, with no music beyond the sound of the city below, and the synchronized beating of their hearts. Can I tell you a secret? Deborah murmured against his chest as they danced. Always. That night, when you opened the door to my room, I should have only been scared or embarrassed. But there was a moment, a second, when our eyes met. And I felt something. Something that scared me more than the exposure. Jackson pulled back slightly to look at her face. What? Hope, she said softly. For the first time in so long, I felt hope, like the universe was saying, pay attention. Something important is beginning. Jackson smiled, that slow, devastating smile that still made her heart leap. I felt it too, he confessed. I didn't understand it at the time, but in that moment, something in me recognized something in you, like my soul was saying, there she is, the person you've been waiting for. Do you believe in destiny? Deborah asked. I didn't, Jackson answered honestly. I believed in hard work, strategy, control, but you made me believe in magic, in synchronicity, in things that can't be explained in spreadsheets or charts. She laughed, the sound like music. Who would have thought the great Jackson Blake would believe in magic? Only the magic of you, he responded, kissing her forehead. They stayed on the rooftop until dawn, wrapped in blankets, watching the city slowly fall asleep and wake again. They talked, laughed, cried, dreamed, and when they finally came down, hand in hand, the ring catching the first light of morning, they both knew. Their journey was only beginning, and it would be extraordinary. The ceremony took place on a golden autumn afternoon, 6 months after the proposal. Not on the penthouse rooftop as some expected, but in a small community garden in the Bronx, the same garden where Deborah's grandmother used to take her as a child, where she'd learned to plant flowers and dream of futures that seemed impossible. There were only 30 guests. Deborah's grandmother, seated in the front row in a wheelchair decorated with white ribbons, cried silently with joy. Margaret Chen was there, along with some colleagues from Blake Tech who had become true friends. James, the security guard, and Maria, the former cleaning woman who was now facilities supervisor, sat together, smiling like proud godparents. And Jackson stood under a simple arch decorated with sunflowers and jasmine, wearing a charcoal grey suit, hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on the path where she would come from. When Deborah appeared walking alone, as she'd insisted, saying she'd already gotten this far on her own feet and would continue that way, the entire world seemed to pause. She wore a simple ivory lace dress that flowed to the floor, her hair loose in natural waves with small sunflowers woven through, a delicate veil that caught the sunlight. There was no heavy makeup or extravagant jewelry. Just her, radiant, genuine, absolutely stunning. Jackson felt tears burn his eyes the moment he saw her. She walked slowly, savoring each step, her eyes locked on his, a soft smile curving her lips. When she finally reached him, Jackson extended his hands. She took them, intertwining her fingers with his, and they both just stood there for a moment looking at each other, barely believing this moment had finally arrived. The officiant, a pastor from the church her grandmother had attended for decades, smiled at them both before beginning. "Love," he said with a soft, warm voice, "is not just a feeling, it's a choice, a promise, a daily commitment to see, honor, and celebrate the person beside you." He looked at Jackson. "Jackson, would you like to say your vows?" Jackson nodded, swallowing the emotion that threatened to overflow. He hadn't written anything. He wanted it to come from his heart. "Deborah," he began, his voice hoarse but steady, "when I met you, I was living, but I wasn't alive. I had everything, but I had nothing that mattered. You taught me how to feel again, how to dream again, how to believe I could be more than my achievements, that I could simply be human." Tears flowed freely down his face now, but he continued. "I promised to spend every day of my life making you laugh. I promised to listen not just to your words, but to your heart. I promised to be your partner in dreams, your support in challenges, your celebrant in victories. I promised to never stop growing, learning, becoming worthy of the love you give me so generously." His voice broke on the last sentence. "And I promised never to forget that the best mistake I ever made was opening that door. Because it led me to you." Deborah was sobbing now, tears making trails down her cheeks but smiling through them. She squeezed his hands tightly. The officiant turned to her. "Deborah." She took a deep breath, finding her voice through the emotion. "Jackson," she began, and her voice, though trembling, was strong. "You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I felt worthless. You loved me when I'd forgotten how to love myself." She paused, wiping tears with one hand, while the other remained intertwined with his. "But more than that, you gave me space to grow. You didn't try to save me or fix me. You simply stood beside me while I learned to save myself. And that's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Her voice became softer, more intimate, as if she were speaking only to him, though everyone could hear. "I promise to challenge you when you need it, support you when you falter, celebrate you when you shine. I promise to be your partner in everything. In big decisions and small moments, I promise to keep growing beside you, not behind or ahead, but together." She smiled through the tears. "And I promise to remind you every day that the door you opened, it was the best thing that happened to both of us." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Even the officiant was discreetly wiping tears. "The rings," he said with a choked voice. Margaret stood, bringing the simple gold bands they'd chosen together. No huge diamonds or extravagant inscriptions, just their names engraved inside and the date of that first dinner they'd shared. Jackson slid the ring onto Deborah's finger with trembling hands. "With this ring I join myself to you," he said, "in every way, forever." Deborah did the same, her voice firm despite the tears. "With this ring I join myself to you, in every way, forever." The officiant smiled broadly. "By the power vested in me, and more importantly, by the love I've witnessed here today, I pronounce you husband and wife." "Jackson," he said with a gleam in his eyes, "you may kiss your wife." Jackson didn't need to be told twice. He pulled Deborah to him, one hand wrapping around her waist, the other caressing her face, and kissed her with all the love, all the passion, all the gratitude he felt. The garden erupted in applause and cheers, but for Jackson and Deborah the world had disappeared. There was only them, that kiss, that perfect moment. When they finally separated, both laughing and crying at the same time, they turned to face their guests as husband and wife. The reception was in the same garden, simple, joyful, full of love. There was live music from a local string quartet, delicious food prepared by a small Puerto Rican restaurant her grandmother loved, and laughter that echoed through the autumn air. During the first dance, Jackson held Deborah close, moving slowly to the sound of an instrumental version of the song she'd hummed that first day, about the woman waiting for her love to return from the sea. "He came back," Jackson whispered against her ear. "In the song. And in our story, too." Deborah pulled back slightly to look at him, confusion in her eyes. "What? You were that woman," he explained. "Waiting, keeping faith, and I was the man lost at sea, who finally found his way home." New tears filled Deborah's eyes. "You've always been so good with words," she said, smiling. "Only when it comes to you." Later, after the guests had left and the garden was quiet under the stars, Jackson and Deborah sat on a bench. She nestled against his chest, watching the city in the distance. "Mrs. Blake," Jackson said, testing the name on his lips. "Mrs. Williams Blake," she corrected with a smile. "I'm not losing my identity just because I got married." He laughed, kissing the top of her head. "Mrs. Williams Blake, then. Are you happy?" "More than I thought possible," she answered honestly. "And you?" "Complete," he said simply. "For the first time in my life, I feel complete." The months that followed were of building and growth. True to his word, Jackson created the Williams Foundation, not Blake Williams, dedicated to education and healthcare for underserved communities. Deborah led the initiative, using her experience and empathy to create programs that truly made a difference. They bought a house in Westchester, not a mansion, but something cozy with a large garden where Deborah could plant, and Jackson finally learned to do manual work, with mixed results that always made them laugh. Deborah's grandmother had her best years, surrounded by love and care. She lived to see their first wedding anniversary, to witness the happiness she'd prayed for her granddaughter to find. And on a spring morning 2 years after the wedding, Deborah took Jackson's hand and placed it on her still flat belly. "We're going to be 3, she whispered, tears of joy shining in her eyes. Jackson spun her in his arms, laughing and crying at the same time, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of absolute gratitude for the life they'd built together. And every year, on the date of that first dinner, they returned to the rooftop garden, now a permanent oasis maintained with love. They stood among the sunflowers hand in hand and remembered. They remembered the mistake that became destiny. They remembered the courage that led them to defy expectations. They remembered the love that transformed 2 lonely strangers into partners, into best friends, into soulmates. And they looked toward the future they continued to build together, a future full of promises, challenges, joys, and the unwavering certainty that whatever happened, they would face it together. Because sometimes the greatest loves begin in the most unexpected places. Sometimes a mistake opens the door to destiny. And sometimes when 2 people allow themselves to be vulnerable, to be seen, to be loved, magic happens. Jackson and Deborah proved that love knows no hierarchies or social classes, that true wealth lies in being seen, valued, and loved for who you really are, and that happy endings aren't the end of the story, they're just the beginning of everything. In the end, the story of Jackson and Deborah wasn't about a billionaire CEO and his housekeeper. It was about 2 lonely souls who found each other at the exact moment they needed each other most. It was about having the courage to defy what the world expects and choose what the heart whispers. It was about transformation, not one saving the other, but both growing together, learning that true love doesn't diminish anyone, but elevates both. Jackson learned that wealth without purpose is just empty numbers, and that true fulfillment comes from being seen for who you really are. Deborah discovered that her strength had always been within her, waiting for someone who believed enough to give her space to flourish. Together they proved that the best loves don't follow scripts. They write their own. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: sometimes the most embarrassing mistake becomes the most perfect blessing. Because in the end, it's not about how you start, but about having the courage to continue when everything tells you to stop. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that move and transform. Leave your like. It shows us that narratives about true love and growth still matter in this world. Become a member for early access to upcoming stories, and if you felt it was really worth it, click the Super Thanks button. Oh, and comment where you're listening from. We love knowing our stories travel the world, connecting hearts. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing these narratives that celebrate the transformative power of love.